Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we are joined by Leyla Jagiella, cultural anthropologist, scholar of religion, and author of Among the Eunuchs. From an early age, she knew she would be defined by being Muslim and being trans. Struggling to negotiate these identities in her conservative hometown, she travelled to India and Pakistan, where her life was changed by her time among third-gender communities. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, explore the historical and mythological context of third-gender communities.
Thank you, everyone. I just, first of all, want to say, Eureka! We found it, the Dye House Gallery. Congratulations. And the reason for that slightly tangential reference from Greek antiquity is I'm foreshadowing a little bit where this discussion between me and Leyla will go. Let me just first tell you who I am before we start. My name is Shannon, and I am a scholar and activist in the area of religion and social justice. I'm a trained sociologist of religion. Half of my week, I conduct research and teach in religious studies. My interests are gender, sexuality, contemporary Islam, and also the intersections of far-right politics and religion and spirituality in the West. The other half of my week, I lead a climate justice charity. It's basically an interfaith charity that encourages and equips people of faith in the UK to take action on the climate emergency. And I'm really thrilled today to be hosting this discussion with Leyla. I've always meant to ask you this, Jagiella or Jagiella?
I'm now so used to being called Jagiella that you can do that, but in Germany we say Jagiella.
Okay.
But even that is wrong because it's Polish originally, so it's all fine.
Well, in keeping with the hybridity of your book, we might alternate. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Leyla Jagiella. Leyla Jagiella is a cultural anthropologist and a scholar of religion working on orthodoxy and heterodoxy in Islam and gender and sexuality in Muslim societies. And as a Muslim trans woman, she has also been a community activist for several decades and has worked as a social worker with LGBTQI refugees in Germany. And we are here today to celebrate Leyla's wonderful book, Among the Eunuchs, A Muslim Transgender Journey. Now, this conversation will touch on some of the themes Leyla covers in this book, and also we'll go beyond it because there's lots of exciting things to discuss as well. And maybe I'll say a little bit about the book before we start so that you understand why this conversation will go in different directions. I think the first thing that I gathered, and I think that you've said as well about this book, is that it is not a book about trans Muslims. And Leyla specifically focuses on her experiences with the Hijra and Khajasara communities in India and Pakistan. And it's not even a book about the Hijra or Khajasara community. It is a book about Leyla's personal experiences and observations and analysis and spiritual insight as well in negotiating her life, and she'll tell us more about that, being born in a small town in Germany and then finding her way living with these communities and finding her way into the very interconnected worlds of her gender and sexual expression and her Islamic spirituality. And it's a fascinating, multi-layered book. It spans many different genres. I think you can count it as life writing, memoir, biography. It's also a work of history. It's a religious studies text. Leyla's training as an anthropologist just inspires and frames the whole framework as well. And it covers a lot of ground. It is a work on the history of Islam. There are discussions about histories of gender and sexuality. There are discussions about the impacts of colonialism on expressions of gender and sexuality in different parts of the world. And there are discussions about the implications of that today. And through that, I think I'm reminded of that quote by William Blake, to see the world through a grain of sand. So through Leyla's eyes, I think we see what it means to navigate and negotiate our lives in this increasingly globalized world, and how we basically live globality, if that's a word, in all its very exciting and also messy combinations, the possibilities and also the kind of toxic politics that come with increasing globalization. So that is the book. I hope I've done justice in how I've introduced it. I think the way Leyla's written it is, in case it doesn't come through already, I loved the book from start to finish. And I think listening to the different podcasts that you've spoken on and speaking to different people who've read the book, there are so many different ways that we have each received it as well. And I think my moment of reception comes when you talk about your experiences in a hijra house in Delhi in the early 2000s, and you'd had a wonderful time with your sisters and the community there, and you were going to go back to Germany, and you were talking about, I don't know if I can go back and face all this transphobia and Islamophobia, and one of your gurus says to you, when you confide to her this reluctance to go back to Germany, she says to you, child, whatever people say or do to you, never forget that you belong to the people who hold the keys to the holy Kaaba in Mecca and to the mosque of the Prophet, may peace be upon him and his family, in Medina. And you were touched and surprised by her words, and so was I. And to me, it's because from then onwards, what it becomes is you tell a history of Islam through the eyes of Hijra gurus who have transmitted this knowledge. And it's not recent, it has a lineage. It's like a silsila almost reading this. And I wonder if it's, if you think that's a fair description for me to say that I felt like I was reading a history of Islam told through this lens.
First of all, thank you for your many, many kind words about my book. I love it that you love it, of course. I'm also struck by the fact that you mentioned it with regards to the podcast that I've spoken, that different people have different impressions of the book. There are a lot of things that readers agree on, but also people have quite different impressions of it. And that is something that makes me also very happy. Because that was something that I wanted to do. I wanted to create a multifaceted story that could speak to different people in different ways. This particular perspective that you mentioned now, that it's a history of Islam through the eyes of these Hijra or Khajasara gurus, is something that I'm hearing from you for the first time. But it definitely is something that I also wanted to include in that book, because we do not usually hear histories of Islam from marginalized people. We do not usually hear histories of Islam from people who are not perceived to be in the center of that history. But to me, these marginalized histories are very, very important. And I do write at some point in the book that I learned in the course of my personal history that to me, the true Islam is not with the victorious, because it was never meant to be that way. Despite the fact that a lot of Muslims feel that way, a lot of Muslims like to glorify historical victories and imperial histories and all of that. But to me, the true Islam is always with the small voices, with the marginalized voices. And the Khajasara community is one of those marginalized voices. There are many other voices as well. And what I also attempt in my book is to show that there are interconnections with these different kinds of marginalized voices. I write a lot about Sufi traditions, folk traditions as well. I write a lot about Shia Islam, but also the very complicated interaction between Sunni and Shia Islam that we find in South Asia traditionally in particular. I write about different queer histories, And through all of that, I try to create this kaleidoscope of these marginalized voices that usually we do not hear, but that also do contribute to the global discourses, that are part of the global discourse. We don't think of these people as part of what we call the cosmopolis, the global society, but they are part of this global society as well and contribute to it, and they shape it. And I try to show that through the eyes of, partly through the eyes of these Rajasara gurus that I spoke to, but as you said, most and foremost through my own eyes, because this is, I don't speak for that community, I don't speak for those people, I'm not in the position, and I write a lot about my own positionality as well in the book, but I have an interaction because I'm also part of this global community, of this global society that we live in now, and that is what I try to represent with that book.
I want to go back to a word you use, kaleidoscope, and also what you said very beautifully about not forgetting the histories of the small voices, the minorities, the marginalized. And I think what you said about that in terms of histories told through the experiences of, say, gender or sexual minorities, and you mentioned Shiaism, and I wonder if there's an interaction, because I think in a lot of Sunni-centric discourses, even when they're invisible about Islam, people sort of think, oh, Shiaism, well, they're a minority, they're a sect. It all started because of this political disagreement, and that's it. That is why. And what is this? What is all this fuss about? Shouldn't we all be one Muslim ummah? Why are people creating divisions in this way? And I think I'm articulating quite a normative position on this, but you have a really interesting take on this as well, which links up with how you're thinking also about gender and sexual experiences. And I wonder if you wanted to touch on that also.
Yes, I mean this again. It has different, how to say, it has different sections. One section is I mentioned that in South Asia traditionally there has always been this complicated interaction between Shia and Sunni influences, and it's not been this eternal clash that people always imagine it to be, or that is often centered in our media discourses actually when problems of our time are discussed, political issues, Saudi Arabia and Iran, or what's going on in Iraq and so on and so on. We always hear this narrative of, oh, there's this eternal clash between sects in Islam. Traditionally, this is not what we see in a lot of Muslim societies, and we certainly do not see that so much traditionally in South Asia. That comes at some point, it comes with modernity, and with modernity people suddenly start to have this insistence on the one truth, and there can be no exception to that one truth. But in pre-modern societies, and to at least, we can say, at least a few generations ago, this was still also the norm in a lot of Muslim contexts in South Asia. People were quite willing and able, or maybe it was also something just natural part of life, to exist in multiple spaces at the same time. So you could occupy spaces, religious spaces, that let's say the official science of Islamic studies would label as Shia, but you could also occupy other spaces that would be called Sunni, and we don't actually see these clearly delineated sectarian identities in the past, and even nowadays, when it's very much a matter of formal education. The more formal education people have, the more they are also indoctrinated. That is something that we forget when we talk about education as something so wonderful and great, but education is always a kind of indoctrination as well. So the more formal education people have, the more they will identify with these strict sectarian categories. But the less formal educated they are, they will be much more, not be very concerned with these identities, but instead they take positive potential out of these different narratives. And one of the important positive potentials that people take out of the Shia narrative is this idea that I just mentioned, that Islam is with the marginalized, Islam is with the oppressed, it's not with the victorious, it's not with the winners, because the family of the Prophet, around whom Shia Islam, but also a lot of Sunni Sufism centers, were in the end not the victorious in Islamic history. They were the marginalized. And that is something that gives a lot of power to a lot of other marginalized communities in South Asia as well. It has a huge importance in the Khaja Sara community traditionally, but even amongst people who would identify as atheist socialists, but who come from a culturally Muslim background, they would also identify with that kind of ethos, so to speak.
Yeah, and again, I was really excited. I'm excited to hear that explanation again and to come across it in the book and your other works, because, I come from Malaysia, and the Islam that was transmitted to the Malay world, like you were saying, it complicated these categories. What was Sunni? What was Shia? In terms of the theologies, the practices, the figures that you venerate. And it was a surprise to me, because as someone born in 1978, the year before the Iranian Revolution, growing up in the 80s in Malaysia, where there was a lot of Saudi Wahhabi influence, and suddenly there was also a great fear and hatred and proscription of Shiaism in Malaysia. So when I discovered that actually historically, even Islam in the Malay world, it wasn't as clear-cut. It was quite Persianate. And if it was Persianate, it meant that it had these influences as well. And you can see it in how it survives. And that actually, the analytical framework that spoke to me, like the way I received the book, was I kept thinking about this analogy that a French sociologist of religion has, Danielle Evu-Leger, whose analogy of religion is like, she says it's like a chain of memory. Religion is a chain of memory, but through processes of modernization and globalization and capitalism, some links have been broken, and some parts of the chain have resulted in mutated memories on our part. And I almost feel like this book is part of the recovery, and if it's not a recovery of a chain, it's basically drawing our attention to the fact that there are parts of this chain that have existed, but we're not thinking about that now. It's a recovered history. I was just wondering, as I said, I was really excited to speak to you, so it's not really a question, it's just putting it out there and wondering what you think of that.
I like that idea, and I think to come back to what we just talked about, there's a third category also that matters here in that chain, and that is probably even more important to the book, much more important than this Shia-Sunni thing that we talk quite in lengthy ways about this, but it's not central to the book actually. But another category is much more central, and that's the category of folk Islam, because one way of modern Muslims to delegitimize and denigrate traditions such as this South Asian Muslim transgender, third gender tradition is often to say, oh, but this is folk Islam, This is some local tradition. This is something that's just, it's coming from these people because they mixed and they syncretized and, but there is a pure Islam, and the pure Islam is prohibiting these kind of things. This is a view that we hear quite often nowadays, and it's pretty much also the basis of what you just described about Malaysia, right? There's also this discourse of, okay, these are folk traditions, but that is not real Islam. This is Shia, but it's not real Islam. These are, you mentioned that quote from my guru who talked about the sacred eunuchs of the holy cities of Islam, and people would say, yeah, okay, that existed for a couple of centuries because of all kinds of cultural influences, but it's not real Islam. And but this so-called real Islam, this perception of this real Islam, has a lot to do with what you just described. This broken memory that people just do not remember anymore. How central and how organically integrated these kind of traditions were to Muslims for centuries. And in a way that also connects them actually to what people think is real Islam, which is the scriptures, usually the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet. And I write about that in my book as well, that these folk traditions, they are not just there because some people didn't understand Islam quite properly and they mixed it up with Hindu influences. And yes, cultural influences and syncretism did happen, but these folk traditions also emerged because people were engaging with scripture, because they were engaging with the Quran and the Hadith. That is one of the sources of these folk traditions as well. So we have to look at these folk traditions in different ways and not just belittle them, but understand that they are part of the Muslims' struggle with God, with scripture, with life, and part of how they figured these things out. And part of life has always been, and will always be, that there are people like me who do not fit neatly into the gender binary. And Muslims in South Asia, traditional Muslims, found a way to reconcile that with their scriptures, with their faith, and that is real Islam to them as well.
I want to pick up that point about the lived histories and realities, but what you said about this dismissing of these sorts of folkloric beliefs as not real Islam, the flip side also happens, right? So, in Malaysia, there's a group called Sisters in Islam. They call themselves Islamic feminists. They're known as that, and they're frequently targeted by state authorities in Malaysia for being too heterodox, for trying to invent new things, to do with Quranic interpretation. And I remember, when I first came across Sisters in Islam materials, it was quite mind-blowing because, as a Muslim man up to that point, if you think about the creation story and you think, well, of course, the first human God created was Adam, the Prophet Adam, and then Eve, Hawa, and then from them created the rest of us. But Sisters in Islam had this strategy of pointing towards the first verse of the 4th chapter, Surah Al-Nisa, the women, where it says, God first creates a soul, and from that soul creates its mate, and then from then on creates men and women. And Sisters in Islam will get criticized or condemned for trying to have this very heterodox, non-normative understanding of the Quran, like how dare you interpret it that way. But you were saying that actually your guru sees that precise verse. I mean, you write about it in the exact same way. Like it's basically what the Islamic feminist hermeneutic of that verse is what your guru shares. But then what really excited me was you go further with that in the book as well, where in the Hijra or Khajasara hermeneutic, then this verse becomes a basis for thinking of the first humans as basically androgynous or androgynes, because they are souls with partners, they are male and female. And what's even blown my mind further is that, I think very near reading your book or slightly after that, I also watched Hedwig the Angry Inch. And there's a song, if some of you know this film, there's a beautiful song in there called The Origin of Love. And it starts with this idea that in the beginning, humans were sort of two-headed with kind of our backs stuck together, and we were facing opposite directions, and we had 4 legs and 4 arms, and we emanated from different spheres. So children of the earth, the moon, I think, the sun. And one of these children was basically, what was stuck together was a man and a woman. And the gods basically split these beings, so that then we became two-legged and we became monogendered or cisgendered. And this is a creation story that comes from Greek sources. I think Plato writes about it. But also this idea that, and I think that links with this idea from your Hijra guru in India that, yes, the initial humans were bigendered or multigendered. And the Jewish rabbis were writing about that as well. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, I think that verse that says, "And God created humans in his image, male and female, he created them," which is what maybe a lot of evangelical or Christians of a certain persuasion now will read and say, and this is it, these are the genders that are made, and that's it, no more genders, just male and female. But the rabbis would have interpreted that as saying, no, but the first people who were created Adam was basically androgynous. He was male and female. I don't know, so I know you like Greek philosophy as well, and you like a lot of this scriptural exegesis. And I was just wondering what you might add to that.
I mean, I like it personally very much. I like Greek philosophy. And it is part of these Rajasara hermeneutics, but not specifically so. It is part of it because it is part of a very established Muslim tradition. And that is something what a lot of Muslims nowadays even don't know, and non-Muslims even know less about it, I constantly get these kind of reactions by people to the work that I do, not specifically my book, but I'm also doing, especially in Germany, I'm doing a lot of educational work around or about trans issues, and I often get these very angry letters that say, "Oh, but there always have been just two genders, and they were. It's very clear what these two genders or two sexes are." And it always surprises me that people have no awareness of the fact that the way we think about gender and sexuality right now at this point in time is socially and culturally contingent. It's not how human beings always thought about it. Human thought processes about gender and sexuality always changed over time, and they will continue to change. That is the only stable thing about it, that it will change, and it did change in the past. So, the same is true for Muslim conceptions of gender. So, the early Muslim community lived in a complex world where people had different kind of sources of wisdom. And our Prophet had taught people to seek wisdom from the cradle to the grave. He didn't differentiate between only seek wisdom from these people or those people. On the contrary, we have sayings of our Prophet that he said that even if you seek knowledge from a hypocrite, if it is knowledge, it's knowledge. It belongs to you. And early Muslims acted according to that. So they were interested in all the wisdom and knowledge traditions that existed at that time. And one of the most important ones that was transmitted through the Christian Byzantine Empire at that time was the Greek system of knowledge. And that influence persists until our modern times, actually. Some of you may know that until today in South Asia, there's a traditional Muslim system of medicine that is called Unani. Unani means Greek, because it's the ancient Greek system of medicine that is continued by Muslims, in particular in South Asia, until today. And part of that medical knowledge was the idea that the original human being was androgynous. And we can say that this is it's not very much in conflict with what we know about how gender and sex develops nowadays. We all know that our gonads, our genitals, it develops out of the same cells, for example. It's just hormonal processes in the womb that differentiate between what we call biological sexes, basically. So the ancient Greeks, they understood this already. And they thought that this is the basis of what we fundamentally are. They were also a very patriarchal society, so at the same time they also thought that well, the most perfect kind of human being should be a male, should be a man. So, but this was a kind of received knowledge at that time, and that kind of received knowledge was not in conflict with that revealed Abrahamic knowledge that Muslims also had. You mentioned it, that in the Bible, in Genesis, we have that creation narrative that also seems to suggest something similar. The rabbis who wrote the Talmud, they had ideas of gender that also very much existed in that very same framework. So for a lot of early Muslims, it was very understandable also to say, okay, so gender is much more complicated than just saying there are these two genders. There is this fundamental unity, and it's mentioned in the Quran in Surah 4, verse 1, as you mentioned, as you said, this min nafsun wahidatin, from one single soul. And Muslim scholars wrote on that. Now, there were always Muslim scholars who also disagreed with that. I mean, we are not trying to tell a story about, this is, the Islamic past, and people had these very fascinating ideas on androgynous gender and everybody. No. But there was a discourse on that, and that discourse was informed by these different kinds of knowledges. And then when Islam came to South Asia, of course, the discourse was also influenced by Hindu ideas, by Buddhist ideas, by other contexts. When Islam came to China, the same happened there. Confucian ideas became an influence. So Islam took all of this in and made it a part of its reflection on gender and sexuality. And we find that in the sources, in the official written sources of Islam, the works that the scholars wrote, but we also find it in these small folk traditions and in these communities. These are all traces of these discourses that Muslims had on this subject. What I see nowadays is actually an impoverishment of Muslim discourse. Not even scholars are really well educated to speak about gender from different perspectives. Scholars nowadays, Muslim scholars, will mostly just repeat something that some other scholars said in a previous century, and they build on that. But this is not how classical scholars would have dealt with it. Classical scholars would have looked at philosophy, they would have looked at medicine, they would have looked at all the knowledge that was available to them, and from there developed their understanding of gender, and it was a very complex understanding of gender.
I think there are so many things that I'm keeping an eye on time so that I'll leave time for the audience, but I have so many things. Okay, just two things I wanted to bring up from there was, one, you said, you mentioned earlier in your response about, the prophetic injunction to just seek knowledge from wherever it is. And, that's kind of permission to admit that, Islam is not a ready-made, perfect, complete system. There's always knowledge to be gained. There is something to be improved on. And I wonder if the issue, like you say with contemporary scholars as well, is to think that this is a pristine tradition, it is pure, what we have to do is guard it from pollution. Whereas there is a strand in, and not just Islam, I think, the rabbis that we mentioned, they were also learning from Greek sources. They used terms in the Talmud that are derived from ancient Greek as well, right? So I wonder if one of the things we have to think about also is that these religious systems, they don't come ready-made. They are always a bricolage. We always pick and mix and build the tradition that way.
Cherry pick, as the accusers say, right? I mean, this is usually what a lot of queer Muslims are taught. You are cherry picking. Well, but the fact is, first of all, that all of us cherry pick to some extent, and the classical scholars cherry picked as well. And the people who decided, for example, which hadith of the Prophet were authentic and which not, also cherry-picked. I mean, they had their criteria, but we have documented cases where we can see, okay, they were also influenced by their own visions and their own ideas in that, and also by their own gender and their own positioning in society. So we also have to see how we can look at our religion, influenced by our own positioning in society, about our own gender, our own experience. And this is the starting point of my book, right? I wrote this book initially not so much as a history of Islam, but as you said, as a very personal story. I wrote it because I was a young person, a young Muslim, who knew that the gender assigned to her at birth was not her gender, and always knew this. Tried to change it because people at the mosque, people in mainstream society, people at in all kinds of contexts told me that I had to change it. I tried to change it, I couldn't change it. So I needed to find ways of dealing with that fact. And you cannot theologize around that fact, When you experience something like that, it's a reality, and you can try to suppress it, and I did try to suppress it for many, many years. But I do think, and we do see that in a lot of people, I do think that if I would have continued suppressing that, I would just have left Islam at some point, because it becomes unbearable. And instead of leaving Islam, I decided to say, no, there has to be a positive potential for people like me as well in Islam. There has to be positive potential in the works of the scholars. There has to be positive potential in the scriptures. There has to be positive potential in the realities of the Islamic world.
Yeah.
And that made me dive into these sources, dive into the works of these scholars, but also seek out these communities in India and Pakistan, also in Bangladesh, but I only lived in India and Pakistan, and really see what their lived experience of Islam is. And only through that could I find a way for myself. And I would say, and I say at the beginning of my book, this is neither a book about transgender Muslims, but it's also not just a book for transgender Muslims, but it's a book for everybody. Because in the world that we live in today, we all find ourselves in that position, that we are all very specific individual human beings with very complicated histories, all kinds of complicated stories. We all struggle to some extent with gender and sexuality. Not only trans people do, not only queer people do, everybody has questions about that. And so we all need to find a way how we can live that and at the same time stay true to our God and our faith.
And I think that is one of the beautiful things about this book as well. If I've given the impression that we go off on this analytical, hermeneutical tangent,
just because we both love it.
But there's also really lovely descriptions of, and as you say, okay, I need to preface this by saying let's not romanticize it, because even with the Hijra and Hajasara communities you lived with, there are issues of power, people fight, they do, but having said that, I think what's really, what would be eye-opening for people is that you actually found a space of belonging, not just within the Hijra Hajasara communities, but also in a social and cultural system where they also interacted with the world around them. You talk about the house being next to a madrasa and a masjid, and all of you going and praying Friday prayers at the mosque, and people were just accepted, like hijras are hijras, and they will be going to the mosque, and that's it, So, and I found that really, it's kind of, that, intellectually, but to read about someone telling that this is the story, this is what they experienced, I think that's very powerful, knowing that it exists.
Oh yes, and that was the experience of power that I had also, because I can talk for hours about ancient Greek philosophy, and I love it, and I can talk for hours about the Quran and the Hadith and love it as well, but it doesn't quite sink into your heart unless you really experience a community that is Muslim, and very piously Muslim and at the same time just does not see any conflict with their trans or third gender identity. You have to experience that. You have to see that you cannot construct that from analysis. It's a lived experience.
Yeah, and I would love to ask you so many more questions, but we do have to, we will open it to the audience, who I think will have lots of questions as well. I'm not being rude. I'm looking at my phone because I checked with Leyla beforehand, and this is what I wanted to close this discussion with, because as I said, the book also talks about the impacts of colonialism and the dynamics of activism nowadays, and especially the clash of activisms as well, some feminist positions on trans rights, even trans activist positions and how they get exported, outside of the West, especially into the South Asian cultural context. So I think it might be a surprise to learn now that this was quite a recent Facebook post from Leyla Jagiella. And Leyla Jagiella writes in Facebook, who is the author of Among the Eunuchs, she says, I'm quoting directly, "I'm generally not interested in trans rights, or any trans issues for that matter. I find them quite boring. I am interested in Quranic exegesis and hadith literature and metaphysics. That's what I love. I'm interested in Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, in ancient Egypt and Mughal art and Urdu poetry, 19th century cosmopolitanism, occult sciences, black magic, demons, and hauntings. That's what really interests me. Trans rights are banal. But here is the thing. If people just don't let us be and threaten us with legislations that endanger our health and our lives, then we simply cannot just be. I cannot be the quiet, introvert, bookish, and semi-pious Scorpio intellectual that I am when you think that you have a right to decide who and what I am and how I should live my life. That is the regrettable issue. So just let me be, for God's sake. Let us all be. Then none of us will have to bother you, because we all really have better things to do than that. It is you who force us to bother you. I'm so glad I decided to read that. When I read that, I thought, okay, this was quite scriptural, a scriptural moment for me as well. It was like a revelation. Oh, yes, amen. But I just wondered if, I think this was about a month ago, and we've seen...
It was a month ago, and it was in reaction, actually. It's interesting what people thought that it was in reaction to, because a lot of people thought it was in reaction to what was going on in the US, where there was some... in general, there's a lot of nasty anti-queer and anti-trans stuff going on in the US, and then there were also some Muslims getting together for a statement against trans people. But no, actually my statement was because there was a court ruling in the Pakistani Shariat court, the federal Shariat court, and that made me quite upset because it deconstructed an anti-discrimination law in Pakistan that was introduced in 2018, actually. Yeah. And so my anger manifested in this post, but yeah, this post is very much what I believe, and I happen to be a trans woman. But because the world and because our society and because of a lot of our Muslim brethren constantly complicate that category, I have to constantly speak about it, I have to write a book about it, I have to travel around the world to find my peace with my Muslim trans identity. I have to do all these things, but I just happen to be a trans woman. But apart from that, I'm also so many other things, and I would like to bring that back into the discussion about trans issues as well, that in the end this has to be a discussion about the basic human dignity that every human being has, and as a Muslim I believe every human being has been given by God, and when we don't center that basic human dignity in our discourses, then we are lost.
Leyla Jagiella, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's such a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening. The 2024 Bradford Literature Festival programme is now live. Visit bradfordlitfest.co.uk to discover the huge range of events on offer over 10 days from the 28th of June. Don't miss out. Book your tickets now.